Bernie and Hillary Clinton were debating during the 2016 presidential debates. You had Hillary Clinton, who was getting hammered by Bernie Sanders on Libya. He was sitting there saying that with Obama it was 50-50, but Hillary was all for it. Hillary was gung-ho for invading Libya.
For President Obama, this was a pretty tough call. It's like a 51-49 call. Do you overthrow Gaddafi, who of course was a horrific dictator? But the New York Times told us it was Secretary Clinton who led the effort for that regime change. And this is the same type of mentality that supported the war in Iraq. Look, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein are brutal, murdering thugs. No debate about that. But what we have got to do, and what the president was saying, is we didn't think thoroughly about what happens the day after you get rid of these dictators.
Then Hillary turned around and she said, now wait a second, Bernie, you voted for regime change in Libya too. And what was she talking about?
I would just point out that there was a vote in the Senate as to whether or not the United States should support the efforts by the Libyan people to protect themselves against the threats, the genocidal threats coming from Gaddafi, and whether we should go to the United Nations to seek Security Council support. Senator Sanders voted for that. And that's exactly what we did.
No.
We went to the United Nations. Yes, he did. We went to the United Nations Security Council. We got support from the Security Council. And we then supported the efforts of our European and Arab allies and partners.
After the Honduran coups of 2009. So Hillary and Obama had helped to orchestrate a Honduran coup to make sure that, their government got into power. So Bernie Sanders already knew about Hillary Clinton's hawkishness, how she's in favor of intervention. Her husband was in favor of intervention. She loves Kissinger. Kissinger is her idol. That's who she, looks up to and admires. So the Senate, that was approved. It was a resolution on March 1st, 2001. Okay, so this is 2 years, right, after the 2009 Honduran coup, which saw Berta Cáceres, an environmental activist, get killed later on because of the coup government. Okay, which I would put on Hillary Clinton and her supporters. Okay, you're in favor of intervention, and guess what? Civilians get killed. And Honduras, what the fuck did Honduras ever do to us? So, March 1st, 2011, the Senate approved a resolution. And it said that it strongly condemned the gross and systemic violations of human rights in Libya. And it was by unanimous consent. So there actually wasn't any vote. So he didn't vote for it, but they just said, does everybody agree with it? He did not object. In fact, he showed his support more because he was one of the 10 co-sponsors. So he definitely supported this. And what it called for was a regime change, but for a peaceful regime change. So they were sitting there just calling for Gaddafi, saying stop with the violence against the Libyan people, recognize their demand for democratic change. So they want democracy, they want to vote. So he's been a dictator for 30-something years, even Reagan had bombed him. Now they're saying you need democracy in your country. You need to stop with the violence, get democracy in your country, resign your position, quit, and permit a peaceful transition to democracy. So step down, Gaddafi, so that way the democratic forces could take over. Well, the resolution actually carries no weight. It's just Congress is just, hey, Gaddafi, you stop that now. But it can be interpreted as the feeling of Congress at the time. What is the feeling of Congress, right? So, even though the sense of Congress was understood, it has no legal teeth. It's just essentially Gaddafi is a bad person and he should stop. So, therefore, you can actually take the document to specifically mean a violent regime change. You can't. But it is a precursor to what's going to happen later on. So this was, it also called, the resolution, called for the United Nations Security Council to take further action as may be necessary to protect civilians in Libya from attack, including the possible imposition of a no-fly zone over Libyan territory. Well, Bernie Sanders understands what's going on. Bernie's not, you're going to the United Nations and you're talking all this shit about one nation. Well, you're making a case that this one nation needs to be, they need to change their ways, and you're going to use economic sanctions, no-fly zones. And that's exactly, okay, so the United Nations to take further actions as may be necessary to protect civilians in Libya from attack, including the possible imposition of a no-fly zone over Libyan territory. So a no-fly zone, if we told Canada, you have a no-fly zone, only America can fly over Canada, they'd shoot our planes out of the sky. So a no-fly zone, while it's a peaceful measure, we're inching towards war. We're inching towards war. What were the two related United Nations resolutions? So there's two United Nations resolutions sitting there waiting to be passed on, and now they just, said Gaddafi's a bad person and he needs to step down and let the democratic forces take over. He needs to care about democracy, resign. And then the United Nations resolutions, 1970 and 1973, called for more drastic measures. They called for establishing a no-fly zone, and then imposing an asset freeze. Okay, so now we're freezing the leader of another person's country, his assets, all of his money. So we freeze all of his assets, and we established, we're willing to establish a no-fly zone. And then we also said he had human rights abuses. So you got human rights abuses, get a no-fly zone, impose an asset freeze. That's what the two related UN resolutions were for. And so they said that it was okay for the United Nations Security Council to take such further action. You got to be careful with these bills because they usually are a fig leaf. They make it sound like they're innocuous, but then you sign it and then you're in war, then you're overthrowing governments. So, and that's exactly how Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, used that Senate resolution and the UN resolutions. She used them to, get involved to overthrow the Gaddafi dictatorship. Obama, he's the president. But Hillary Clinton, she said, while our military mission is focused on saving lives, we must continue to pursue the broader goal of a Libya that belongs not to a dictator, but to the Libyan people. That's what she said at an international conference, March 29th, 2011, 28 days after Bernie Sanders signed this Senate resolution, which called for Gaddafi to step down, to recognize the Libyan people's demand for a democratic change, and to permit a peaceful transition to democracy. And it supported the United Nations, the two United Nations resolutions, which were saying no-fly zone, he's a human rights abuser, no-fly zone, get an asset freeze on the members of his regime, not on Gaddafi, but on all the people in his circle. So, while the resolution didn't explicitly call for regime change, it was served as a basis in order to invade, and it might have been that's all the Obama, regime wanted it. The only thing the Obama administration wanted was, hey, senators, do you agree that Gaddafi is a bad guy, and if, he was to be gotten rid of, would you feel bad about it? And Bernie Sanders said, yeah, it's okay. And then the United Nations made it even more explicit, no-fly zone, imposing an asset freeze, calling all these, human rights abuses, telling him to step down so there could be a peaceful transition to democracy. If Bernie Sanders didn't know what was happening, I would be, I'd be shocked. I'd be shocked. So this is more of a middle-of-the-road issue. Bernie Sanders also voted for the war in Kosovo. He voted to put boots on the ground in Somalia. He voted for the Iraq Liberation Act, which led to a quiet war against Iraq for 5 years from 1998 up until the 2003 invasion. He also supported those economic sanctions, which starved out 500,000 to 1 million Iraqi people. Bernie Sanders' military record is in doubt. It is not perfect, and that's okay, right? It's okay that somebody's not perfect. But we need to look at this, and we need to understand what is the difference between a regime change in Libya and a regime change in Iraq. When he was on Fox News, he just playfully suggested, we're already in Iraq, we're already in Afghanistan, I don't think we need another war in Libya. You don't think, or you don't know? Which is it, Bernie? I mean, he did not take a very clear, cut position, absolutely no war in Libya. So I've got to know What's the difference, Bernie? What's the difference between a war in Kosovo and the war in Iraq? What's the difference between the war in Somalia and the war in Iraq? And why did you support the Iraq Liberation Act so Clinton could bomb Iraq? That's okay if Clinton's bombing Iraq, but when Bush got into Iraq, what is the difference? I need to understand the distinction. If he is going to be the president, then I want to know what Bernie Sanders' foreign policy is going to be. I need to hear from my politicians is if you're going to have these fig leaf resolutions that says so-and-so is a bad person and we're going to have economic sanctions, we're going to have no-fly zones, and we're going to freeze their assets, and we're going to try to do all these, give weapons to the opposition, do all these sort of peaceful interventionists, the regime change and their interventionists. But I actually think that if, it's okay to support the opposition, it prevents you from actually, sacrificing your own people's lives, but you can stake out a position. So what I needed from Bernie for when he's, sitting there signing this or unanimously consenting to this Senate resolution, when there's 2 UN resolutions sitting there, and you know what UN... The point of the UN is to stop one country from invading another country, and then the whole world gets together and says, hey, you stop doing that. So he knew what was going on. What I need to hear from Bernie Sanders and anybody who's against the war, any politician who's against the war, when they sign these fig leaf Senate resolutions, which could be used as a basis for war, to explicitly declare that you're not for war. Straight up. Don't say, I don't think it's time. Straight up say, I'm not for invading Libya. I am not for a regime change. I am not for empire. I am for, the United Nations doing their thing. That's what I need. That's what I need to hear.